Welcome back to the Cash in Common podcast. Here we are again with myself, Ryan Martin, and Roberto Pelaccia.
That's me.
My expert and one of my really good friends in the real estate space in particular. We got lots to talk about today. We want to try and touch on a lot of subjects. We also want to make sure on Saturday in co-ownership. So we're going to do a little sort of, guess you could say, a little mini seminar on co-ownership. We'll talk about it. We'll get you to pretend like you don't want to buy into co-ownership or something like this, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
We'll see what happens.
I'd like to hear your expertise on the subject.
Yeah,
Maybe
well,
you can explain to us what it is.
I will do my best. I'll try to explain, I give kind of the legal take on things, address some of the concerns there from a legal perspective, see if we can sort of help people out who are thinking about it, or, like introducing them to it. A lot of people don't know that this sort of way of exists. We were talking before the podcast about joint venture owning. Oh, what do you call it?
I called it joint venture ownership.
Joint venture ownership. Yeah, joint venture ownership. That's what it is.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Is that the certified term? Probably not. Is co-ownership the certified term? Well, I'm trying to make it the certified term. I think it should be. I think it should be the term. Anyway, so listen, man. I think that we get started by talking a little bit about the market. We see where the market is here in Toronto.
It's a new year,
and look back at 2022 to see what it is that's happened, and see if we can make some sort of a prediction about what we think will happen moving forward. So what did we see in 2022? We saw a substantial decrease we saw a blip, as they call it, in the housing market with respect to prices of houses. We saw that, a lot of withholding of listing property, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of not knowing what's going to happen next. Bank of Canada recently has now raised rates again. Mm-hmm. We don't know where that's going to take us. All to say now, what is the next? What can we say about what we anticipate will happen in the future? And also, what do we say about 2022? What can we say? Does that make sense given the state of the economy? What does it mean for mortgages? What did it mean for mortgages in 2022? Did you see a blip? Did you see a drop? Did you restructure the way you thought about business in that space? What do you think? Rob, any thoughts there so far?
2022 was an interesting year, to say the least. I think what we all kind of got from 2022 was a new perspective of how quickly it could change. I think when we started, the messaging and branding around rates increasing from the Bank of Canada was very temporary. Things will be a little more short-lived and not so intense because these supply chain issues will somehow improve. And I think, our branding in the industry was around that as well. We were like, hey, listen, just hold on and roll with it for now because it's temporary. So what we didn't anticipate, I think, was, and I don't think the Bank of Canada anticipated either, was the necessity of increasing after increasing after increasing. I think once the inflation numbers came to face month after month as they were growing, I think the Bank of Canada had no choice but to really forge forward with the increases. They have to stay legitimate, right? Like their job is to focus on inflation. So they had no choice but to start moving and increasing rates at a pace that probably, hasn't been seen since, the 70s and 80s, right?
That's what it says.
And so that, that scared a lot of people. I had a lot of clients definitely worried, what am I supposed to do right now? Looking back, there wasn't really a lot of options for folks. I mean, their variable rate mortgages, for the most part, were still outperforming most fixed term mortgages.
Is that true? Like
not true anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But for the majority of last year was true. It just became more challenging in the fall. That's when variable rate mortgages were actually going above and beyond.
It was a very abrupt sort of change, right? Like you had
it was totally abrupt, yeah.
These increases happening. The more you sort of feeling out and trying to adjust to what's going on, and then like, okay, by the end of summer, you're into like 4.5 rates. Is that what we're seeing? Something like that?
Well, right now we're at the Bank of Canada's rates at 4.5.
Oh, sorry. So I'm thinking
Right?
I'm jumping ahead here.
But there. So what ended up happening was by the fall time, people had variable rates that were basically, in the 6% rate, right? So and fixed rates at that point, were just under 6. So
Okay, yeah.
variable rate owners are not used to that, and there wasn't any solace. Like, you didn't really want to lock in, right? You're like, well, I don't want to lock in at this rate.
Right.
And for the most part, that's the advice I think most of the industry was giving their clients, right? Like, well, if you lock in now, I mean, you're committing to now this high rate, this payment that you don't like, and now you're saying I want it for the next 5 years. So there was some clients that took advantage of 2 and 3 year rates. 3-year rates seem to be better at this point. They're looking around low 5s, high 4s. So that's looking pretty good. But 5-year rates have started coming down significantly in the last couple months.
What kind of advice were you giving at that time, though? So like you started to see rates increasing. I feel like we had a talk in the middle of just before the summer about, okay, well, I'm going to shift the way I do things, help with cash flow, because it's going to start to become, I mean, it's definitely for some families now, one of the most important things to be thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
So did you start to see an increase in planning with respect to taxes, with respect to cash flow?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the conversation went that way because it was a matter of just saying, hey, you know what? I can't really control the rates going up. Locking in doesn't really seem like a bright idea either. For the most part, we still feel this is a temporary situation.
Yeah.
Everyone sees moving forward that rates will probably stay elevated towards the end of the year, when we actually start seeing the Bank of Canada may start decreasing rates.
I was thinking that Canada. I thought that rates were going to stay somewhere in the range of 4.5 to 5. That's what I've heard. Is again, I'm not an economist or expert there, but my understanding is 4.5 to 5 is something like a healthy economy would see it there based on what Canada's GDP is, and we would expect that something like that would be the settling point. But that seems high, is what you're telling me, right? Like, I mean, it seems like that would be high. It is harder for, let's say, a family that locked in at 2% back in, 2008, 20, whatever, and now they're dealing with 5.5, potentially 6. I mean, I don't know. It seems high, but also, if that makes sense from an economics perspective, I don't know.
Yeah. So the Bank of Canada has a rate where they want to be, right? And so that's typically, between 2 and 3%. So that's where they want to see inflation, right? So if you think about right now, we have inflation that's in the high 6s, mid 6s. It's coming down. And now we have rates at 4.5%. So they're trying to edge that 2%, right? At 4.5 to 6.5 is 2% difference. So they're trying to bring inflation down and teeter their rate down with it. So as that gap gets smaller, then they'll start decreasing the rate. So as inflation comes down and they're still at 4.5, they'll realize, okay, well, now we're going to bring it back a bit. As well, I mean, the biggest, I think, factor moving forward is there going to be a recession? How is our economy going to be affected by all these rate increases? And that's why I think they're holding on, right? Like, there's been, I'm sure you've heard and read that right now, Bank of Canada is not going to make any moves. They're going to wait and see how this plays out now, because a lot of these rate increases actually take about 12 to 18 months for the economy to actually absorb them and see its way through. And so as the months come ahead here, we should, in theory, now start seeing inflation come down.
Right.
And economy will slow down, because that's how we're bringing inflation down, is actually we're actually deflating domestic demand, right? We're basically making, people's lives expensive in other areas, so they have less money to spend on other parts of the economy.
Right. So it's a way of slowing the economy down, right? Getting
Exactly.
people to spend less. I think it's all well and good. It's fine as long as we don't see something happen with respect to employment over time. As long as everybody stays employed, I think that's okay because, you raise rates. That means that's fine. We've got a rebudget strategy as a family. I'm sure a lot of people have been going through this. One of the problems is if you lose that income, you really sort of put yourself into a place where it's going to be very challenging, right? And I don't see, based on the numbers that they're showing now, it doesn't seem like employment is changed much. In fact, I think employment is growing in the country generally. I don't know about the U.S. I think we're speaking specifically about the Canadian economy here.
Right.
I don't see that we've had an issue with respect to employment. That really leads us into a place where we're not going to see a ton of crashing happening necessarily, or at least defaulting happening in the industry, in the mortgage sector. We don't want to start to see crashes. Hopefully that doesn't happen. We don't want to.
Defaults are at the lowest rate ever.
That is so interesting.
Like ever in history, like default a percentage of basically people not making their mortgage payment is at the lowest it's ever been in the history. So, I mean, in that aspect, I think things are going well. And as far as employment's concerned, it's interesting because this time around, I don't think employment is going to be as big a factor, or it might be a little more selective. So what I've also read and heard is that this might be more of a white collar recession versus a blue collar recession. Meaning, like, from COVID, we still have huge gaps in labor sort of intensive type of industries. There's, generational shift right now with baby boomers, retiring more and more every year. So what they're saying really is that there's going to be less need for certain types of services, professional services. So and in tech jobs, we've seen losses over there already, and so that's what they're calling it, for more of a white collar sort of recession versus a blue collar recession, which usually blue collar jobs tend to get affected the most during recessions. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out, definitely. But there's still a big pull on employment. I think companies are all still hiring in some way or shape or form and trying to fill in the gap. So no recession's ever the same. Like no, boom and bust cycle, as they call it, is ever the same from the previous one. So this one's definitely going to have its own flavor, let's just call it, and methodology of how we got into it, and certainly how we get out of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny you say, white, that's interesting. I don't know where you read that or if you saw that, but I feel like that makes a lot of sense. I would say it's interesting how COVID has an impact on that reality. I mean, you really see white collar jobs sort of shifting, or at least there's a big flux right now in this sector as to whether somebody should be in the office, somebody shouldn't be in the office. And what you have is a lot of these white collar workers, people in sort of office related jobs, let's call it that, right?
Yeah.
Are sort of toying with the idea of, hey, I don't really need to go in. I'll quit this job. So this whole what is it? What are they calling it? The great
resignation.
The great resignation.
Yeah.
Right. The great resignation is the great resignation, but those people got to work somewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
they do. It's true.
They got to work somewhere. They got to find a job elsewhere. The question is, okay, they're going to line themselves up with a stay-at-home job or a virtual job. Can they do that? How many companies are willing to shift into that mode? I really think you have a lot of sort of bigger companies, even visionaries. I mean, you got like the Bezos, is not the Bezos, is you've got the Elon Musks of the world now still resisting this idea of like working from home, the idea of that shifting. And so you have this tension created between companies right now with the great resignation, people wanting to resign versus everyone wanting to be big, so CEOs wanting people back in the office. Whether that's going to be a long-term, what's going to happen there long-term is, I think, going to have an impact on employment. We're going to see either a shift, either up or down. I don't know. I really think that companies, to me, I see it as it being necessary to evolve. You got to have an adaptive workplace, a hybrid workplace at best. If you're going to have workers coming, I'm hearing now Amazon is going to want everybody back in the office. We've got other players now big players wanting people back in the office.
It's been a slow transition. I know my wife works for one of the major 5 banks in the recruitment, department. And as far as like her workplace, huge buildings, still empty. She already kind of worked from home. They already had a mix of all this started already in her department well before COVID started. So, but the odd time she'll have to run into the office to grab something for a presentation or something. And she tells me it's a ghost town, like no one's there. And I mean, this was, buildings very bustling with people every day, so it's interesting. I think right now it seems to be optional. I don't think anyone wants to, force it too much because they know the job market is tight. There's not enough employees to hire, right? Or potential place. And it's competitive because, maybe a company down the road in similar line of field that they're doing now will offer them something where they're flexible and where they can work, right?
Yeah, I mean, you see that I see it as a potential cascading impact on commercial real estate, right? I mean, you've got less people in the office overall. Companies saying, well, we don't need as much office space. Let's decrease that space. Let's renegotiate our lease. Let's look at less space in this building. It's really tricky to say, okay, well, what will happen to commercial real estate? The way that, I mean, I see it evolving potentially is, well, we're going to have to repurpose this space. We're going to have multiple offices in here rather than one single renter. That's a potential way in which the problem gets addressed. Doesn't solve the problem entirely because we don't know what will happen, but I can see it as a cascading effect. If that happens, we got a shortage of leases, open vacant space. We've got now landlords with empty buildings. Seems like, what does that mean? They now don't have the revenue or the income that they were anticipating. You've got big companies like Brookfield saying, well, this is going to be a real problem. What are we going to do? How are we going to, they've got massive overhead that they've got to take care of themselves. So that's where you can start to see that real estate really in Canada. I don't know if it was you that was talking to you said to me that like real estate in Canada is really the shifting. It's the shifting part of the needle. If real estate is shifting, we'll start to see the rest of the economy topple, and that's true of most economies, but in Canada in particular,
Well, I think everyone knows that. I think every Canadian knows in their heart if they don't need to sell their house right now, they're not. Right? Like, why am I going to bite into a loss? I think they recognize that hysteria would be the worst thing that can happen in right now, right? If we just started seeing a flood of listings all at once, the market would crash, right? Like,
sure.
And it isn't just, property owners and their homes. It's also investors. Investors are having a tough time right now because they're coming up for renewal. Their mortgage payments have just gone up by additional, 30%, some even as much as 100%, and you're not making any more money on the property. I mean, yeah, you could increase a little bit if you're lucky not to be under rent control, but there's only so much the market will pay you, right? So even private investors are having a hard time, and they're debating, do I sell now? And the consensus is no. The messaging and the branding from the Bank of Canada and all these economists is this is temporary. We have to do this to resolve this issue, and we want to do it this way intentionally so that we're not missing the mark and letting this problem get out of control and have a scenario where we had basically in the 70s, right? And having actual mark points of where they want to be, right? Like they want inflation to be between 2% and 3%. So that whole idea that we can actually gauge that and watch that evolve, I think is really important. That was a big difference maker in past, or difference being in the past, in prior recessions. They learned that was an issue. And so people's expectations were always that I need to be paid more. Companies then evolved that idea that inflation was a permanent part of what was happening.
So they raise wages, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Case.
And so like the
Yeah.
wages keep on going up. Companies have to make decisions around that. So the cost of goods continue to grow. So to control that, years later, we've evolved. Well, I shouldn't say we, but really the Bank of Canada and the government and the economists evolved actually by having expectations and having these numbers out there. So we could track this and we can see, everyone in the economy can see how this is progressing. And I think that's really important. I think that's what's holding people back from just sort of this hysteria of selling, because they know it's really fragile. The branding of this is that it had to be done this way and it will be over soon. And we can actually see it. We can see it. Okay, this is keeps on going down. Great. Hold on. Right. So I think that's what's going to spare us moving forward. It'll probably be some of the slowest sales volume years for real estate, ever, or, since, who knows when, right?
Yeah.
And I think that will be our savings grace, believe it or not. A little compression in the real estate market right now will probably have more benefit for all of us as we go forward. Because let's face it, the demand is there. Pent up demand is there, and we could talk about that with co-ownership.
That's true, actually.
Like it's I'm busy with people that are trying to figure out how to get into the market now that things have slowed down. And what will happen is, as rates come down, the demand is going to start flourishing. Like it's just going to grow even more. People are going to feel optimistic again, and they're going to want into the market, and that feeds sellers, right? The sellers are going to feel the same thing, and they're going to start listing. And I suspect 2024, as rates start coming down, because I do believe that's when we're going to start seeing a really big shift. I honestly think, if they're at 4.5%, I could see them being around 2.5% by, middle of 2024.
What is the stress testing situation like now? So have they?
That's the biggest stress.
Yeah, so the Bank of Canada.
No pun intended.
There was a change to that recently, right?
Well, no, there wasn't. I mean, there was a lot of talk about let's examine that. Let's consider how we can change that. And quite frankly, the OSFI is the federal regulator of all the banks, basically. And they're the ones that implement this stress test, and they're basically saying, hey, we are in a great position because we had the stress test, because the stress came. Everyone was tested. The stress came, and we're all surviving. So they're taking a lot of credit for it, which is great. But, in the industry, we're like, hey, listen, now we're choking everyone out, though, at the same time.
Because it's
can
still
we
in
do
place.
something about it? And, they're saying, no, we don't want to, we're trying to tamper out a fire, which is essentially, inflation. If we add some gasoline to this, which is what they feel lowering the stress test or getting rid of it would be, then it would work contravene to, against what the Bank of Canada has been obviously working kind of hard to achieve here, right?
Right.
So I don't see any changes in that. How that can fluctuate later, I could honestly see maybe first-time buyers and people that fit into the insured bucket. So mortgages that are going to properties that are less than $1 million, and properties.
No, those are tough properties to find in big metropolitan
Yeah, of
areas,
course.
for
No,
sure.
no. Like, I mean, these are sort of entry level folks. They're going to put less than 20% down. So they're like, folks coming in with, 10, 15, 5%, where you'd have to pay that insurance fee, CMHC fee, I could see them extending the amortization for that. I could see that happening in real time. Like,
Right.
I can see that eventually rolling out, throwing them a bone, because affordability is never being addressed. Like I just have to say that, make that clear. Like, anything you see happening in the mortgage industry, if it's talking about affordability, it's just political speak. Like, nothing is more affordable in the sense that prices have come down, but interest rates have gone up. But that is the nature of those two things. Like
Sure.
that they always work like that, right? As interest rates go up, we see prices of homes come down, and you'll see the exact same effect. Once rates go down, you'll see prices go up. So, things aren't more affordable because it costs more from a payment perspective. I wouldn't say it costs more. I would say it costs the same.
Right.
In certain cases, you can even save some money, but we're not talking about like all of a sudden I can afford to buy a house. Like if you really couldn't afford it before, like, that didn't change,
Sure.
I think if you wanted to buy and sell in this market and you were in a good position before, you should do it now. Might cost you more on an
Really?
interest rate, but you're buying an asset at a discount. And we
True.
know later it's going to go up once those interest rates go down.
Yeah.
Like that's arithmetic that's been proven
It's tricky to
time
know.
and time again.
I think it's tricky to know when it's going to go down, right? I mean, we don't know that interest rates, when they're going to happen. When is that going to change? And so what you have, I mean, arguably some people would say, well, yes, you're buying it at a discount, but it isn't as big a discount as people were hoping, right? I mean, we're not seeing drastic drops in prices. We're seeing maybe a 10% drop in areas like Toronto, downtown Toronto, right, where I live. We're not seeing anything major. And you have this pent-up demand is continuing. People still want to get in. We don't have a potential solution for that. I don't know if you have, how you've been doing with respect to actually qualifying people with respect to this. I don't know how that's panning out. I think we're going to see the problem with that. It's just like it's just stagnant because you don't have the ability to meet that lower price point with the demand that's out there, because the demand out there doesn't have the capability.
Yeah,
So
it's a supply
right.
issue.
So
right?
what's the capability going to look like in 5 years? We don't know. I mean, I think we're going to get to a place, hopefully, where demand can again not outpace, but at least increase to a point where demand can actually meet, or the capabilities can meet what the demand is. Because right now I feel like you might want a house, you're just not going to be able to afford it right now, right? It's just, we still don't have incomes matching or outpacing inflation, and so you have a very difficult circumstance where people just can't afford things. They just cannot afford a house, and you've got a good, these aren't people who don't have jobs even. I'm sure that you've got situations with individuals now trying to qualify where, like, they've got on paper what seems to be good, but maybe they're carrying some debt, makes it kind of tricky. You've got that stress test to deal with.
That's always the case for sure. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like affordability is something that can only be really truly addressed if you really start building out some really niche policies to help people get in the market.
Yeah.
If we'll ever evolve to that point, I hope we do. But the other part of the equation, it's not capacity. I think we can always change things to better the situation. The biggest barrier or issue that we have in the Canadian real estate market, especially in the bigger cities for sure, is supply, right? Because anytime you do anything to help anyone out, it just shores up any supply immediately. It just absorbs it because there's so much demand, right? So we just don't have enough houses.
It's interesting because builders are complaining right now that they can't get things sold, right? So we've got this.
Yeah, builders are greedy.
Hand.
Can I just tell you that? I remember buying.
Sorry, builders that are out there, but the reality is,
you guys are. Let's be honest. Like I remember buying properties. I bought properties from builders many times. Okay, for myself and in investments. You got a deal when you bought from a builder. You got a deal. Okay, you got it for a better price than resale.
And
the
you got
idea
good
was
finishings.
You're helping fund a project, get in early, and you'd save some money. You'd make equity just based on the fact that you're getting in early. What has happened is because there's so much demand and not enough supply, now you pay a premium. You want a brand new building, you want a brand new lot, a house, whatever. It's more expensive than retail on the market today. And you're expected to be okay with it because prices always go up. So what we've seen now, as things have progressed over the last 12 months is people have bought at way too high of a price given today's market. So they bought into, let's say, a condo project, and they paid more than what a condo was probably going for on the street at the moment. And they're wondering what's going to happen when this thing finally comes to close, let's say, in 2024. Is it going to be there? Because they've lost money. They haven't, they already bought high, but they've now seen the actual resale values of current condos similar to theirs already go down, right? So they're stressed out, and I've had quite a few clients actually closing on new development properties that were purchased, let's say, in the last 2 years during this hype and boom that we've had, that are wondering how they're going to close because they just don't think the bank will give them the value that they purchased for it.
Yeah, and that's one of the major circumstances there. And from a legal perspective, I mean, I don't like to beat up on builders because I think it's important. We need houses to be created.
Of course.
We need subdivisions to happen. But I do think builder agreements of purchase and sale are major problems. There's major problems with those agreements. We're seeing a lot of indemnifications, protections for builders, forcing someone who wants to buy, because they're trying, at least, even before when it was affordable to try and get in, you're hamstringing yourself as a buyer because you don't know what you're getting. You may end up signing up for, they call them tied selling agreements where you're being forced to sign up with a peripheral agreement with some other organization for, I don't know, supply of utilities in your property.
Yeah.
Right?
I had that issue.
You had this issue, right? Mm-hmm. This is, those agreements are very, and now more than any other time, we want people to get into the market. It'd be smart on the part of a builder to say, look, we're going to make some concessions. We're going to think about higher finishings. I understand right now it's a cost game for them. You got timing issues with respect to supply chain. A lot of construction projects are behind right now, so you've got a challenging situation. But you've got to now convince the market. You've got to get these consumers on board to buy these properties. There's got to be incentives, and there's got to be benefits to you as to a consumer who's thinking about going new. Because the reality is you don't know what you're buying. You have no idea what you're buying until it's built. Where does that leave you? Yes, I think affordability, this is the CMHC has now come down and said, look, we're going to give incentives to builders who are looking at affordability and prioritizing that issue on their builds. And that the reality is now builders got to go even beyond. You got to think about it listen, we're trying to solve an economic problem. We know that there's a buildup of demand. We know that there's a huge influx of immigration happening in Canada. Right. What are we going to do with those individuals? Force them to rent at prices that don't make any sense, or are we going to create some housing that actually can get them into the market, right?
For sure.
It's like they've got it, and I think it does start. A big part of it will start from legal agreements and a changing of the guard, if you will, on the builder side with respect to who's drafting that work, thinking about it through the lens of, hey, we're trying to create and solve a problem rather than just make a buck off of what's happening,
Right. Yeah, for sure. I agree with you. I think there needs to be that change. Markets, they ebb and flow, right, at the end of the day. And, there was a lot of shift in demand and sort of authority from the developer side. And so they were able to kind of, ask what they wanted, and the market for the most part tolerated it, so
for a while, yeah.
They're just gonna simply have to shift as well if they want to sell the inventory.
I hear a lot of projects are getting canceled. You got sort of a problem, or at least they're getting seriously delayed. And
because I mean, it's not just labor and material. I mean, they just can't sell the units.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, in some cases they're double the price what you can buy right now. I'm pretty sure you can get a market. That's crazy.
A brand new condo downtown Toronto right now. A one bedroom is over $1 million.
Yeah, it's about 50. Honestly, if you're in Toronto, you're definitely paying $1,400 a square foot.
Yeah, $1,400 a square foot.
I mean, that's pretty much the minimum.
Insane. You would think, okay, we're hitting or bumping into a potential recession. How come we're not seeing that square footage cost at $1,000? You know what I mean? Builders got
Well,
to
they built the business plan on 1,400, so they're trying to
Yeah.
execute their business plan. I mean, that's what they're trying to do,
For
right?
sure. And they've done
And
the
they're probably
research.
going to have to readjust. Now, Doug Force come in with this new rule. I'm sure you've heard about it. You know, basically forcing municipalities to give away, let's just say, their right to charging development fees, and basically just impeding that process so that it's out of the way, you know, and developers can now make more affordable housing. I kind of have issue at that because I mean, listen, these are public private companies that are simply trying to profit from
driven,
developing, developing land. I mean, and we need them. That's great. You know, I think there's nothing wrong with them. I actually like developers. Like I don't want to beat them up, but they are who they are, right? Like they're there for profit. So if you just give them something as a gift to increase their margins of profit, I mean that's what they're going to do. What do you think they're going to lower their prices and just simply make less money or like shrink or maintain a certain profit margin so the consumer can get a better price? Like unless you're going to police them to do that, there's no point of allowing municipalities to miss out on this revenue because you think developers are going to pass on the savings to the consumer. Because I mean, that's very much not going to happen.
100% is not happening.
Yeah, and then the municipalities, they need money, right? Like, you know, the GTA is full of great communities that have been developed very nicely, like very well engineered, even inside the city. As things renew, they renew better, you know.
Yeah.
They're well-maintained cities, to say the least. And so a big chunk of that revenue comes from developers and charging them basically fees and permit fees to do what they want, which is to make money. So I think I think it's a mistake on Dougie's part. I can't really see what's inside his mind. Obviously, none of us can read each other's minds, but I'm not sure what his thought is around that. I don't see that, you know, adding to affordability at all, like 0%. And I think, you know, from a political standpoint, I think that's going to hurt him and probably create unnecessary enemies. You know, like he probably had supporters that would flop over or not be a supporter because the fallout of this is soon to be seen, right? Like people are going to get their tax bills.
Yeah.
And they're going to be like, oh, well, that went up. And they're going to ask their cities, and their cities are going to point their fingers to him, right, in his office. So
for sure, I think there's just a lack of creativity there.
Oh, totally a lack.
There's a lot of options. Like there's a lot of incentives, right? So affordability really is a central piece with respect to this co-ownership element, right? Like a lot of it has to do with affordability. Now affordability, like nobody wants to use that word. We've got a realtor who's on board, who's going to be at. So, you know, just to talk about affordability, we'll talk a little bit about co-ownership right now, I guess is, you know.
Yeah, what is it? Why don't you kind of tell us what?
Well, I'll tell you, look, a central piece of what co-ownership is essentially the ability to buy property with more than one person, right? So you're buying with your sister, your brother. On the one hand, we see a lot of that. Your sister, your brother, your mother, your father. Somebody's coming on title. They're helping you out. This has been happening for generations. This is what happens, how people help their family get in the market. That's the most common way. Then we start to see other more creative ways where we've got four friends who are at university together. Their parents have given them a bit of money or they're prepared to assist. These 3-4 friends say, look, we live in a place together. We rent in that place. Why don't we think about it from a bigger perspective, get into the market, get ourselves ahead while we're in university. Let's buy a property together, right? Hard to do in Toronto. Fair, expensive. But if you're out in these other areas, Guelph, Hamilton, you can see that that's a realistic possibility. You're out in Ottawa. I wish I had the foresight to do this when I was an undergrad, to be honest. To turn to your friends and say, look, let's stop paying this rent and let's just get a foot in the door, get ourselves ahead with respect to real estate, asset building by pooling together what we can and getting something together and buying together. And co-ownership is really becoming, of course, in an unaffordable market. Yes, it's hard to get in, but the reality is you're really setting yourself up for the ability to do it if you've got, you know, you're pairing people together that have some ability to contribute to that.
Right, you're pooling your assets together.
Pooling assets together,
your resources,
and you're saying, look, we're prepared together to do this together as a group. There's a lot of challenges with respect to that, but look, it's solving an affordability issue at its core. I like the word affordability. I think a lot of realtors need to warm up to the fact that doesn't mean you're talking about everything has to do with poverty and taking the homelessness off of the street. I understand the homeless. That's a serious problem.
Yeah, it's a different conversation.
But really, the conversation we're having here is not affordability because we're trying to end poverty. It's affordability because we're trying to get people into a market that's out of range for most people, right? And it's a way of solving that problem, getting people into the Toronto market in a way they haven't been able to get into within the last year and a half, 2 years especially.
Right.
Turning to each other and saying, look, let's just do this together, and it's interesting because you're starting to see people turning to people that can help them to say, look, hey, I'm going to buy a property. Mom, Dad, I'm going to buy a property with 3 friends. Greg, Susan, and I are going to buy this property together. Can you help me?
Right.
Your parents are probably more likely to help you, actually. They're not about to waste away and give you money for rent necessarily because that seems like, okay, I'm just, right, where's that money going?
Yeah, it could be like a 10-year plan.
Not to say that you don't need, you don't need that freedom at university. But now you're putting your money into something that's going to grow over time. Rob knows this better than anyone. It's probably very useful to have an asset so early. So you're seeing a lot of that cohort getting into co-ownership, right? So buying with multiple people. That's one thing.
Do you see multiple families trying to do this? Like people that are,
where you got
a little past that stage of their life, they may have families already. Are they doing this as well?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So I was going to say, one of the other cohorts is you've got sort of people sort of more into the twilight of their life saying, look, I've raised my kids, they're grown-ups, they've got their own houses, but now I'm alone. I'm worried about what that will look like for me when I'm unable, or I've now come upon a disability and I'm not able to walk on my own, and I want assistance there. Yes, of course, families' expectation would be that you would take, and I think it's a cultural thing. It depends on a lot of cultural elements, but the point is you may want to, people are now starting to say, look, I see the value in giving up my house where I live by myself in this big house and buying into something else with 4 friends or 5 friends. And we're going to live in a, communal environment, and we're going to chip in for the buy there. We'll all sell our properties, buy this other house, which makes more sense for our ability to live and simplify our lives in a lot of ways, because now we can help each other in our sort of twilight years of life.
Yeah, because owning a house is not just about a mortgage payment, isn't it, right? Like there's other expenses that come into play here. So if you're pooling your resources to own the home, you're also pooling your resources to maintain the home.
That's true, yeah.
And I think that's an important aspect to think about, because there's property taxes, there's just general maintenance of the houses, windows, roof, driveways, all things that eventually have to be taken care of. And obviously it's an investment, so you want to take care of your home. It's pride of ownership, of course, as well, right? So if you could kind of do that together, I think it's a bright idea. I think it can really work out for a lot of families.
It's funny
it's definitely a growing trend. I definitely hear you talking about it all the time.
Well, I think the pride of ownership thing is really the key, right? I think people, this model really relies on the fact that, when you own something, you're going to treat it differently than if you were to rent, right? You're likely to treat it a lot better. That means that now you've got a built-in mechanism for people preserving this property, preserving the asset, right? Something that you couldn't say that you were going to do with renters necessarily. And you, as somebody who has had renters, I'm sure can speak to that point. And, you really see sort of this built-in idea of taking care of something that you own and the pride associated with that. And I think a big part of it right now is just educating people on the fact that this is even possible, because a lot of people don't understand how it can be possible. We've got banks that are sort of skeptical of the idea. People, banks often saying, well, we're not prepared to lend to 4 people who just met each other, as an example, or people who, may not have, you've got person X who has stability in income, and then you've got person Y who's sort of precariously, they've got precarious income, but they're a student prepared to contribute in whatever way they can. Those two people may make sense from a co-ownership perspective, but a bank says, look, that doesn't make any sense. And so what you need now is banks understanding that there is a pride of ownership element built in. So even if that person doesn't contribute initially, they're going to have a long-term capacity to want to contribute and want to preserve this asset because it's theirs.
Yeah, for sure. I could speak from the lender's perspective. I think it's how you package it, how you communicate to the bank about this. This is one of those big differences between working with someone that works at a bank versus like a broker. This is a huge differentiator right here, is that someone that works at a bank simply is going to take in that information and just pass it on, right? And just basically say, hey, these 4 people want to buy a house. What do you think? And there's an underwriting department that's going to start asking all these questions because that's their job, actually. They're there to underwrite and make sure it makes sense. They're not putting themselves at risk.
They want to protect
from a
the
reputation
bank. They want the bank to be protected.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, the repayment of the loan, right? But, so that's where I think like a big shift in services and building a market is important, right? And that's what brokers do. That's what real estate agents do. Some of yourself, you're trying to shift that market right now, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's amazing. I appreciate you doing that. But, we're going to make that market because we're going to educate the bank, right? And I've done this in past for clients, had multiple people on a property. Some have lived in the property, some haven't, where you just say, hey, like this is their opportunity to own. This is their relationship. And they're not always just strangers. I think this oftentimes works best if there's some sort of relationship going on. But you don't need to be related, that's for sure. I've done plenty of these where people aren't related. But I think ultimately we have to...
You mean related like family?
Like family. Like, I mean, like actually, like,
Sure.
This is my brother and we're buying a house, That stuff, I mean, obviously, banks would never have an issue with that. But it's more around packaging the idea that this is an economic move, so instead of everyone paying rent, they're buying this together, and then the story works out on the other end, because there's another end to this too, right? Well, where are they coming from, right, as well? Like who are they before this, and does it all streamline in? I think that oftentimes is where a lot of people don't do well, is they don't kind of package the story in a way that completes all the questions and anticipates what those questions are. So that's where I think there's a failure, as far as whoever's intaking that information for the purpose of getting the loan. It's you just have to kind of sell the whole thing, the entry, the exit, and who are these people? How are they going to really make this work? And once you kind of get that all cohesively together, then I think a lender can just basically say, all right, well, the numbers work. The story now makes sense. Let's evolve this. Let's do it, right? So I think that's a very much a big part of this.
And the numbers have to work. The numbers have to work in that they still need to fit into that formula. But I would go so far as to say that there may be circumstances in where the numbers don't work, but it makes sense given the story. And so maybe that's your job, is to sell the story, right? Part of selling the story, I think, as well, is like what I would be doing on the legal side, which is getting an understanding of what is, like you're saying, what are they coming in with? What is their history? What's the arrangement here?
Yeah.
The co-ownership agreement is really that's where we see that we address these fundamental issues. What is the arrangement here? Who is going to indemnify who? Who's going to protect who? Who's going to protect the bank if Sally is out of work all of a sudden? What's going to happen in this circumstance? Is the bank going to feel a default, or do we have something built in? Do we have a mechanism built in?
Well, I feel like they have that already, right? Like, and these terms, like joint tenancy basically means like you guys are joint on this, like in the sense that you will actually be there taking care of this place,
Well,
like
joint tenancy,
maintenance and the payments, like everything, right? So I mean, I feel like something like that exists already. I think it's a matter of like, getting the story to line up to make sense with that. Because at the end of the day, there's could be people that are just simply investors,
Sure.
right? And then the bank will understand that. So if I'm using the investor's income to help qualify for the deal, that will be a harder sell for a bank like TD, for example, to get behind, because the investor has a life. Like, he's just looking for a return on his money here. Does he want to be actually liable for this? Because the person that's there every day is going to be Bobby over here, and like Bobby has a shaky job, so and the last couple of years things haven't been that great for him, and now he's got this new full-time job. It's great, but now they're concerned, right? So when we're painting the picture, I think for these lenders to really bite into this, it's really about seeing it holistically. And that's where it goes beyond the numbers. The numbers are always there. I mean, at the end of the day, we can bypass issues with numbers sometimes, for sure. But, mathematically, they do have a formula. They could probably extend a little outside of that range if the story makes sense. But, if you're talking about big banks, at least like that's not their gig, right? They don't do just story loans, right? That we have a whole bunch of other lenders that do that kind of stuff, right?
And so that's what it is. Like, you plug into those guys.
Yeah, non-prime lenders are great. They cost a little more. They'll get behind anything if they can see how they can get paid and eventually an exit. And there's a range of who those lenders are. It's not just private lenders. They're sort of, we kind of do the whole ABCD thing. And so A lenders are your, typical banks and brand names, and your B lenders are banks you probably have heard of, but they're the ones that where you start getting to like non-prime lending.
They're usually monoline lenders. Like they only do mortgages usually.
Yeah,
right?
typically. Yeah, exactly. And then you have C lenders is where you sort of get into these like companies that do privately pooled money for the purpose of investing in real estate. So
they're
things
not
called
banks.
mix. They're not banks at all. So these are non-institutional prime lenders. And I say this D deals are just like actual individuals that lend out money,
Yeah.
and they help out, they're great for really, those things that are quick and definitely need to rely on story more than anything else.
Sure.
But and that's a spectrum, right? Is numbers all the way at the A side and story all the way at the D side, and like that scale of how much story and numbers kind of count sort of slide down between A and D. And so, I think there's always an option for most clients. It's just a matter of, is it doable? Is it something that you can carry? Does it make sense? Can you see this through? Because that's what no one wants, is default. So you mentioned before, right? So I think co-ownership, I feel like it definitely has a place in the market for sure. And I could see why it's getting more popular.
Yeah.
Because to live in a metropolitan area like Toronto, for example, if a really, really, really small home is at least $1 million these days, and, two small families can live in it, well, their pooled income has to be pretty much at least $200,000 to qualify for it. So,
Right.
And you think about that, right?
Sure.
Meaning, one of those families, if you've split them in two, is $100,000. They're only able to afford something that was $500,000, right? And so, you go on Realtor.ca sometimes. How much do you see in that price range these days in Toronto? Not much.
We don't
right?
see that, right? We don't see that here. But look, I mean, I think the issue is, I think you're right. There's a lot of creative ways in which we solve the problem. The problem, I think, is that you still end up having to pay more to solve that problem. And affordability is sort of the reason that we have this as an option. So a bank, to me, should see the ability to say, look, we're trying, again, just like a builder, we're trying to solve an affordability issue. This is where you see the Canadian mortgage and housing corporation should be turning to the banks and saying, listen, guys, you got to figure out a product, because this will get people into the market. And then the broker can come back and say, here, look, you guys have this product. We can, they fit into this category, right? And part of the reason, I think, is because there's a gap of knowledge, the ability to really look at the history of a person. And it's
That's
not,
true.
I don't think it's a bad idea to look at the history or the intentions of an individual. The co-ownership agreement, to me, should be part of this financing process, right? If you've got a co-ownership agreement that says, look, this Sally has 2% interest in the property, she's not really going to be the concern. The concern you're going to have is with John and Sarah, who own, each 49 and 35% each, or whatever it happens to be. And those are the people that you're going to be looking to for money. And the group accepts that to be the case, right?
Right.
And the co-ownership agreement really is the function. It serves the function of clarifying what that relationship is for anyone, a bank, for the realtor looking to find a property that makes sense for the group, because, Sally's not going to be living in the property, but John and Jerry are going to be living in the property, 2 different units as an example. So, it's about a more cohesive, to me, I see it as it's about a more cohesive model, and that includes something that makes sense for banks. And we, I think the reason I continue to do talks on it and push the idea is because I do think once the right person gets in front of CMHC, I think there's going to be something that happens, because there's not a lot more land left in Toronto to build.
Right.
And so really what we got is the ability to go denser on properties that already exist. But in order to really make that make sense, we've got to have a couple things. Number one, you've got to have some creative ideas for how to make those properties into something else, right? Into a co-owned property, one that can be, 4 families can live in and own together and live not feeling like they're cramped. And we, at our event on Saturday, we're going to have an architect there. She's going to talk about how you restructure properties like that. And then you need creativity on the financing side. So you need creative brokers on the one hand now that are like, look, I'm prepared to tell a story about what's going on here. But one of the other elements we need is the banks to come on board with the idea that, listen, it's about a different kind of test, given that we're talking about co-ownership. And that's the real question. Can we get to that stage? And I think with enough knowledge, I really think we can get there. The lawyer is sort of like I'm the conduit for understanding what the relationship is going to be. Who's going to pay what? How much are they going to pay? How much interest are they going to pay? What if they die? What are we going to do?
That's
in
a
that
good question. I think,
right?
In part of this whole journey, what does an exit look like? Let's say a family wants to sell up their portion. They're like, hey, I want to cash out.
Sure.
Yeah. And so they expect probably a profit because they own the house, right? We all do. When we sell a house, we're expecting to make a profit. So how does that pan out in real time?
Well, in real time, there are different scenarios, right? So, for instance, one that we've just sort of worked on recently, we have a niece, aunt, and friend of the aunt living all in one house together. Or I don't know if they're all in one house together. It doesn't matter. They own this property together. On exit, there's different ways. So again, you can have this set up in different manner, in many different ways. For these guys, the way in which they'll set it up is, upon exit, a notice has to happen to everyone. I want to sell my share in the property. I want to sell my interest in the property. Okay. You want to sell your interest in the property. Now, 2 things can happen there. Can you sell a partial share in a property? The short answer is, legally speaking, you can do it. If it's by way of consensus and everybody agrees, then sure, you can do it. But if that is not the way in which it'll happen, that triggers a sale of this property, right? It triggers a listing of the property at the very least, right? And now you build in a listing provision. Say, okay, well, you've provided notice. That means that within 60 days, we're going to have to list the property. And then we have mechanisms for how you list that property. Who's going to choose the realtor? How do we decide on the price? How many appraisals are we going to have? Is it going to be appraisal? Is it going to be a comparables analysis by a realtor? It's like there's a handful of different elements. And once you map them out, you think about them all, you're just like, oh yeah, we got to decide on all of those little issues, which you would do by yourself, no problem, right? You're just like, whatever. But you've got 4 or 5 people to contend with. How are we going to go about doing that? And this is a lot like a joint venture agreement where you've got a property and that property is, you have an intended amount that you expect to return to those investors. The difference is, people are all on title here. They're interested in getting, of course, yes, money back on the one hand, but it's about comfort. Can you kick a person out? This is like their primary residence. What are we going to do? Right? Is there a provision with respect to that? Okay, now are we going to cover Sally's rent if she moves to another place for a period of time? Is that going to be part of the sale provisions that have to happen? Or are we just not going to sell? Can we have a partial sale? And this is where realtors also have an opportunity to say, yeah, I can sell your share to another investor. Or, if the co-owners agree, to someone else who will share in the living space that's prepared to take on the obligations of whoever it is that's leaving. So you really have a lot. It's dynamic. You have a lot of elements that can be mapped out in different ways. And the interesting thing is you don't really have any legislation with respect to this. You have like the Land Titles Act that sort of gives you a basic provision for ownership, but we don't have a co-ownership act that tells us co-ownerships have to be arranged like this and they have to be arranged like that. We don't have any of that. So what we have is kind of a blank slate, and we got a lot of elements that we got to take into account, right? And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I feel like that's what you're looking at.
No, for sure. I think you did. I mean, when I hear what you're saying, my first thought comes to mind is this is very niche, and I could see why it's not for everyone.
True.
It's something that I think can work really well for the right people. And that's probably, those dynamics that you just spoke about will probably be the reason why it
makes people nervous.
Well, it makes people nervous, but I think it'll make, like, it's still a small market. It will, like, I know it has a potential to grow, but I don't think it will explode because that's those. But I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know, but I just feel like hearing, like, those things that need to get mapped out will probably freak a bunch of people out, to say the least, right? So I think, but I think there's value there. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about where people can get together and make money and exit from real estate and be more hands-on about it, right? Like, and own maybe not an entire house, but a part of it. And I know the clients I have worked with, all over time have found way to make money on this.
Sure.
And do it some way, somehow, make it work for everybody. But I have to admit, it'd be interesting to see the congregation of, like, let's say 3 people or 4 people that didn't know each other before. When this becomes more of a, like, because I'll admit, I haven't had one of those files yet where there are complete strangers, and how we evolve that. Because I think you could get it to work and get it in. I'm just curious in, like, how the exit ends up happening afterwards. Because, yeah, see, it's someone's home, right? At the end, you're right. Like, there's something you said that really made sense. It's like, what happens to that person once they leave? Are we going to write in our contract that there's some sort of accountability to us?
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, you're right. Like, sometimes the only way to exit is selling.
In circumstances, yeah. I mean,
yeah, like, if the other people can't take over the loan and make it all work, because that person has an expectation of taking money out, and there's an obligation to each shareholder, right?
Sure.
Then the only other way to make that manifest is by selling.
Right.
And now you got to find somewhere to live, though.
And that's the thing, is that is sort of the circumstances that we're in now.
Yeah.
What you also have is you've got a number of organizations popping up that are trying to figure out a way to match people, right? So what you have is, you plug into a database much like you would if you were in eHarmony looking for a date. Similarly here,
right.
You'd be saying, look, I'm looking for a co-owner. I want that co-owner to partner with me. And you've got Housemates, which is an organization that's coming to this event as well. That's their whole job.
Really?
To put together events to help co-owners or people who are interested in this idea come together to see if they could buy it together.
Yeah.
Right.
Mingle.
Right. Exactly.
To
And
mingle and to find each other.
there'll be, I think,
I like the idea of that.
I think
actually.
these guys have a plan to do like a mingle session.
Yeah, for sure. It makes sense.
At the event.
Like, like if you actually bump into somebody, you start conversating, and suddenly you're like, all right, well, I could, we could share a house.
Sure. I mean, it's like anything, right?
It's funny because I feel like people would actually meet and like actually hook up, like be like I like you, and like, yeah, let's buy a house together. Why not? So I can kind of almost see that working out on a higher level, right?
Well, when you see it, look, I mean, I think, I hear you on your point. I think it's niche, but I think it's like these little systems, once they're in place, it sort of makes it more palatable, right? Because you have, I have a place where like, okay, I can match people based on my criteria and what we're looking to do. And you can see this kind of happening for investors. Like they're like, instead of going straight to equity investing, I'll just do this. Like I'll buy with someone else. And I'll buy this house. Right.
That's,
so that's
where
that's
my
one
thought
element.
too is that, this could be a financial product in itself.
Yeah.
Where you're just buying shares of a house with some sort of contract in place. There's a monthly return, maybe. I don't know. But like I could definitely see a product, like an alternative product that can be funded by capital markets, because I could see myself kind of doing this. I privately lend money, and I like investing outside of normal things, right? And I find something like that could be really, really interesting. So but you have to make a market for it.
For sure.
And what you do for a living is really interesting, because this is a fine detail type of product. At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. There's a lot of minutia, like that you have to just, put together so that everyone is safe, because really that's what it's about. Like none of this will fly and the government would shut it down in a minute, right? If you start putting people's lives or livelihoods, let's say, in jeopardy, right?
Yeah.
So I think, so would you say right now it's at the grassroots right now? Is that sort of like what's happening, you would say?
It's interesting. I'll tell you, co-ownership is not new, right?
No, it's not.
There are big buildings downtown that are like 10-story buildings that are co-owned buildings. They are co-owned buildings.
Like co-ops?
No. Co-ownership, co-owned buildings. They are governed by way of a co-ownership agreement. You've got everyone on title. Sally owns 0.5% interest. John owns 0.7% interest, depending on the size of the unit. They just different buildings have done different ways.
Wow, that's I didn't know.
Co-ownership exists. The problem is again, it's a comfort level thing. So banks recognize them as co-ownerships, but they fund them like mortgages, like they would a condo, right? So instead of treating it as a separate entity, they've just sort of lumped it together with condos. And they said, well, that's really just a condo.
Like a condo development.
Yeah, that's a condo. But the reality is like, legally speaking, not really, because they don't own the space that they live in. They own the building, a portion of the building, even
right,
it's a 10-story building.
Brick and
they own
mortar.
it. And the reason is because, it was for a while, especially in the 70s and 80s, you've got a lot of lawyers that were doing these kind of co-ownership agreements. They really just look like condo declarations in a lot of ways. And they, it was a way for developers at the time to get around having to qualify as a condo. We say, no, everyone who buys into this property co-owns the building. It's not a condo. We're not issuing parcels per unit. We're issuing transfers every time someone new comes on board. So we just issue a series of transfers to the building in tenants in common, percentage interests for each of the people. And I don't know, they make an arbitrary decision about how they determine the percentage interest. Usually it's the size of the building.
There's structure for this. There's precedent. There's, this exists, in historical practical use. So that being said, is that maybe the way to go?
Well,
is basically starting more grassroots from the building, and instead of like buying a single family house with a basement and deciding who lives where and the percentage ownership, let's say, okay, like we're going to build let's say 6-unit building on this lot, and essentially we'll fund it. We'll get funding from these banks, because they should, if they've done it in the past and they currently have money parked on there now, I can't see why they wouldn't do it again.
Yeah, and I think, I think there's a gap in education. The bank doesn't know that what's happening at this grander scale is the same thing that's happening at this 4 or 5 unit scale, right? 4 or 5 unit scale. Plus, I hear you about palatability again. What I would say is it's niche, but if you think about it, it sort of opens the door for things like, I'm going to go buy this big giant piece of land and find some 5 people that want to own this land with me,
right?
And then we develop this land together, right? So this is sort of like, this is pretty popular in like California, right? Like there's a lot of co-ownership in California. There's lawyers and law firms that specialize in co-ownership. That's all they do. They don't do anything else.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wow.
And so you would buy the land together, develop the land, right? They have communes in California. Those are all owned, kind of co-owned by individuals, right? You've got, right? Or one person owns it and like whatever. But the reality is, no, you can create it, but you can think about it less like a commune. You say, look, we're going to buy this 5-acre piece of land and we're going to build 3 houses on it.
Right.
For our 3 families, we'll do it together. And that's like, other people are like, that's never heard of that before. And that's the thing.
Well, that's a big deal.
That's
like
sort of
Europe.
that is what's happening. We've got farms now.
Yeah.
Like one of my clients now is like a farmer. She's interested in selling off pieces to other people she's been renting to. So now what are they going to have? They're going to have an interesting arrangement. Everyone's going to have an interest in what's going on. And again, pride of ownership, likely to take care of it, likely to want to do interesting things to it, develop it, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's like owning parcels. I mean, now it's just a building, right, in a city versus a farm. I mean, essentially.
Sure.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I think this could be a packaged product. I think that's really what it needs to happen.
For
All
sure.
the elements need to come into place. Just like we were talking about developers before, but I think you would, I could see this taking off really in the city, especially where now we have new bylaws provincially being passed through that there shouldn't be any more restrictions on like how many units can be on a property, and all that stuff. So like this has, I think the ball can really roll on this in a new era. And then there's laneway houses as well.
Oh my God, we need a whole podcast for that.
Yeah, well, definitely, no, for sure, because I know that's another thing Ryan's really into and has a passion about, is laneway houses, and so like this is where I could see this all coming to play, right? Like I'm gonna sell a portion of this property. You develop the laneway house, like, right?
Exactly.
You build it now, and now we co-own this one lot, right?
And we got exclusive use rules about who can use the laneway house, what the plan is there. A lot of times you see this sort of happening where you've got, again, an aged individual, someone in the twilight of their life saying, look, I want other people around. I've got a laneway on my property. Let's get someone on board. Now you've got potential, and then now I think we have a circumstance recently. Now you've got buyers coming in saying, look, we'll build a laneway house. Well, we want your main house. Well, we'll give you exclusive use rights to that laneway house. You can stay there. You can have it.
Oh, that's interesting, right?
We'll come on title. Now we all own this property together, but there are rules that we put in place about where people are going to reside, or where I can be and can't be. And so, that's why you're seeing the popularity of laneway housing, and in conjunction with co-ownership, that's sort of something that's flourishing in the city. And that's why, and again, another piece of education, that if realtors were aware of that, they could turn to people and say, look, hey, I got an interesting idea or an interesting circumstance where we've got an older person who's prepared to give you their house if you help them develop their laneway house. So now and you get a serious discount maybe on the fair market value to do that. Who knows, right? And so it could work. It works out in a lot of ways for different people. It's just a creative way of getting in the market again.
So on Saturday, you guys are hosting something. You mentioned, where exactly is it?
Yeah, so Saturday, we're going to do this at the Center for Social Innovation, so at the corner of Bathurst and Bloor.
Nice.
Starts at 9:30, I think, Dre. We're starting at 9:30 in the morning. It's a whole day event. We'll put up some stuff in the show notes here just so that like people can know what it is, and they can come out, check it out. 9:30 a.m. to all day 5. I think I'm talking in the middle of the day or something. 11:30, 12 o'clock.
And so can you highlight just a bit about what people are going to learn.
So yeah, I mean, all what we talked about here, we sort of deep dive in a lot of those elements. You got a realtor who's going to sort of talk about what it's like to sell a co-owned share in a property. Also, some of the opportunities with respect to what kinds of properties lend themselves to co-ownership. You got that sort of specialization happening.
For sure.
And then you have someone in financing talking about the challenges and the difficulties and also the ways in which you overcome some of the obstacles of financing something like this. You've got architects that are going to be there that are going to talk about unique ways to repurpose space for co-ownership.
Yeah, that's huge.
Right? And then you've got someone, I think, from the Bank of Canada. I might not know that 100%. There's someone in the banking sector that's going to give us some pointers and some tips on how this fits in with the economy as it's currently, and what they expect to see in the future and how this fits into that picture. So you're getting kind of a rounded experience. And of course, you got me. I'm going to sort of deep dive into co-ownership law. Boring, but we'll touch
You're
on
exciting, Ryan. What are you talking about?
We'll touch on some of those elements. I'll try not to make it too boring. We'll talk about how you structure the arrangement and things to think about, implications, the law as it stands today with respect to this. Just to quell some people's fears about it.
Is there going to be a mingle session?
They will. They're setting up a mingle date session for co-owners.
See
if they fit and how they fit and how that whole process unfolds. Because there's also someone there who's in the business of matching people together.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I by the way, I'm not the lender that's going to be speaking there, but I might actually go check that out because I feel you guys are putting together something really good here, and I mean, even myself to broaden my own education.
It's not closed off. I mean, if you want to become one of the guys that does the financing, I mean, I don't think anybody's opposed to that necessarily.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, hey, maybe at the next event, but yeah, I think it's great. I mean, what a great opportunity to just learn. Even as an investor, I think, like I said, if you're like me and you want to just find different ways to invest in real estate, just get real returns. I hate putting money in the stock market. I mean, I know that's sacrilegious to say, but I do. I love having other ways of earning, especially if it's cash flow producing. So it'll be interesting to see. I might go and just put my glasses on for that reason too, and see if I can think of a way to just be an active investor, because I think at the end of the day, co-ownership relies on investors as well, right?
100%.
Being involved. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds like a great opportunity. It doesn't matter what walk of life you are, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think if you're interested in real estate, there's no harm in seeing another sort of side of the coin with respect to real estate. And this is something that's happening. It's a movement. It's happening. People are interested and trying.
It's like a grassroots revival.
Yeah, kind of.
Because it's not
some communes here and there,
I don't think Toronto will lend well to communes.
No.
Definitely see that in California, but I don't see that here. But I think
we laugh about this now. Wait till we watch this podcast in 5 years. I don't know.
Then we'll really laugh, right? But I think there's something here for sure, and it's
cool.
It's amazing that you're at the forefront of it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks. Well, look, I mean, we're, I think, at the end of the podcast right now. Maybe we wrap it up.
I think so, yeah.
And listen, guys, thanks so much for listening, paying attention. Hopefully we'll see you out there on the 4th, this weekend, this Saturday. But, of course, we're going to continue to do this podcast. We'll talk about a lot more interesting things. We'll get some realtors on, talk a bit more about the market, see where things are, always trying to track what's going on, get some different perspectives.
Yeah, I think we were discussing even chatting about health and mindset and money.
Health, mindset, money.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good one. There's a lot to be said about, that for sure. So I think that'd be a great one as well.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to deep dive into that. Maybe we can get somebody on that can talk about health in a different way.
Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Okay, we'll wrap it up, and we'll see you guys soon.
See you later.